Mhm.
I just want to welcome you to our June 2nd Saturday, where we have Reverend Warren Lynn as our guest presenter around Labyrinth and retreats around Labyrinth. And so many of you know Warren. He's we claim him here in the Northern Lights region for one who served several congregations in our region. And we give thanks for the work he does with Disciples Home Missions in the Office of Church Vocation, keeping pastors and regional ministers and administrators somewhat on the same page, which I'm sure is not an easy task. It's kind of like trying to gather us all together. But we are grateful, Warren, for you and for your ministry. And
Thank
I
you.
will just turn it over to you.
Okay. Well, I'm going to do a little bit of housekeeping first. Hopefully you all printed off the handout that came to you, the sheets. We will need those at various times. I sent along several different kinds of labyrinths. And so when I invite you to use one of those labyrinths, essentially they are finger labyrinths. It's on paper, but you can use your finger in it. I know that some people may have their own finger labyrinth, maybe carved out of wood. If you have that, then you don't need to worry about these. One of the labyrinths that you printed off, it has real pretty design in it. And that was a labyrinth created by a friend of mine who also practices, if any of you are familiar with Zentangle, that's a Zentangle labyrinth. And she made those available because sometimes people like to do something during meetings or just need something to keep themselves busy. And to nurture your artistic side, that's a labyrinth you can actually start coloring. And you're welcome to use it and print it off and keep making more and more if you want. But for our purposes, probably one of the three non-Zentangle labyrinths is what you'll want to use. I'll refer to the other handouts throughout our time together. The other thing that I'm going to do on a couple of occasions is invite you to turn off your video. At the beginning of an exercise, and then when you actually finish the exercise, because we may be finishing up a little bit different times, when you actually are finished, turn your video back on, and that tells me we're all ready. So I want to make sure I see all of you here. So it looks like there are 9 of us. Well, actually 10 of us, but 9 screens. So I'll be kind of tracking that. But I thought we'd start with a little bit of a centering exercise. So from the handouts you have, choose one of the labyrinths that you'd like to work with today. Maybe just the one that speaks to you most, the one that seems more attractive or more friendly to you, and put that on the desk in front of you. And at this time then, I would invite you to turn off your video feed. Check in with your body for a moment. Make sure you're in a good, comfortable posture. Place your hands in your lap, close your eyes, and I invite you to begin to breathe slowly, deeply. But find a good rhythm for your breath that suits you, that helps relax you. Find a pace that is slower, deeper, restful, and just breathe for a moment. In, out. Notice your breath. Take a moment to give thanks to God for this gift of breathing that is so automatic, so normal, so mundane, and yet so miraculous and life-sustaining. In your mind now, can you find something that distracts you from being fully present here now? Perhaps an important task that is yet to be completed that you keep thinking about, or a person for which you hold concern, maybe some personal matter or physical ailment of yourself, or something else. Think of the things that are distracting you from being present in this time. Now envision God next to you, waiting, arms open, waiting to receive that which keeps you from being present in your soul's imagination for this time. Imagine picking up all of those things that distract you into a bundle of concern and hold them out. Hold them out in front of you and hand God that bundle of concern. Imagine God reaching out and taking that concern from you, promising to care for, to watch over, to nurture, to embrace all that which is of concern to you and keep it safe while you're away from it. Hand it over and let it go for a time. Now, when you're ready, open your eyes. It's time to move our spirits into this place. So place one of your index fingers at the entrance to the labyrinth in front of you. Holding your finger in place at the entrance for just a moment. Observe the labyrinth's path beyond your finger. Notice the twists and turns. Notice how it is so much like life and faith. Moving away from distraction is never a straight path. Check your breath. Breathe slowly and deeply. And now slowly but steadily begin to trace the path with your finger from the entrance to the center. Guard against moving too fast. Finger labyrinths have a way of being over before you know it. So move slowly. Continue to breathe slowly and deeply while your finger moves through the labyrinth. Trust the path. Pay attention. Breathe deep. Continue to follow the pathway, but once you arrive in the center of the labyrinth, place your hands back in your lap and close your eyes, paying attention to what you hear in your mind or sense in your body. Check in with your feelings. Is there still distraction? Are you holding tension in some part of your body physically? Do you need to stretch that place out, your neck or your shoulders? Once you arrive in the center and have your hands in your lap with your eyes closed, take some time just to focus on your breath. Take time to stretch out any tense muscles. In your mind, share some gratitude with God for this Sabbath moment of rest. And simply breathe. There in the center of your sanctuary that is this moment. If you've made it to the center and you've had some time to check in and breathe and share gratitude to God, and you're now ready, go ahead and place your index finger, eyes open, back into the labyrinth's center and begin to trace the same path back out to the entrance. Pay attention to your breath while you do. Again, mindful, deep, slow, restful. And simply move back through the labyrinth, breathing, focusing on breath, paying attention to the path before you. When your finger finally exits the labyrinth, place your hands in your lap. Search your mind and your heart and find one word, the best word, to describe what you just experienced. Whether it's a word of concern or a word of celebration, a word that is a question. Whatever it is, find that word that for you is the best description. Take your time, but when you're done, go ahead and turn your video back on and simply rest until everyone else is also finished. If you would like, you can go ahead and write your word down on the labyrinth paper somewhere. Anytime you use a labyrinth for an exercise, whether it's walking or a finger labyrinth, a lot of people like to journal as a follow-up. But it's not the kind of journaling where we all have perfectly thought out words and sentences. It's just those ideas, those fleeting expressions that we're holding that we elicited, that came to us in the experience, just writing them down real quickly and getting them down on paper before they disappear. Kind of like waking up and quickly jotting down what you dreamed about before you forget about it come breakfast time. Okay, I think we're all back. So I invite you to turn on your microphones, and if you want to, um, anytime I invite people to do something, it's always an invitation. It's not a demand. Um, I am one of those people who tends not to answer things in crowds when I'm asked to do something. So I certainly understand that. But if you'd like to share your word, I invite you to do that.
Mine was everlasting.
Okay.
Mine was peace.
Flow.
What was, oh, okay,
Flow.
flow. Okay.
Mine was floating, kind of a floating relaxation.
Okay. Let me ask all of you now. I want to know what you know about labyrinths, just real briefly. And I'm just going to ask some questions and you can raise your hand. How many of you have ever walked a labyrinth before? At least once. Okay. Everybody. How many of you have walked labyrinths many times, several times, however you define that? Okay. Yeah, some. Okay. How many of you have ever had training or work and actually use labyrinths to lead groups? Okay, a little bit. Okay. So all of you have some fair experience with labyrinths. It doesn't sound like any of you are coming into this with as a totally kind of newbie without any sense of what labyrinths are. But I think a good place to start is, what is a labyrinth? And you have one of the parts of pages of the handout is a handout that I have available on my Well-Fed Spirit website. By the way, I think in the second half of today, we're gonna look at a map on my website, but wellfedspirit.org is my website that provides spiritual practice resources. And each page is a different resources for a different practice. And one of the pages is on labyrinths. So this is a handout that you can download from that site. What is a labyrinth? This is one answer to that question. This is an answer for folks in the context of Christian communities. And you can take time to read that, but basically know that labyrinths are simply pathways. I have a friend who, when he works with groups and he says, what's the simplest labyrinth you've ever seen? And they all kind of hem and haw, and they think of maybe one that only has 3 circuits of circles or something like that. And he goes to a whiteboard or a chalkboard and he draws a single straight line, point A to point B. Labyrinths are just pathways. Now, they tend to get used for lots of purposes, and we'll talk about some of those in a bit. For Christians, though, this notion of labyrinth as a winding pathway we can document has been in our context, Christian context, for at least 1600 years. So from very early on, Christians were using labyrinths. We don't exactly know how or why they used them, but they made a very clear presence in the Christian community from very early on. And we tend to use them in the context of contemplative practice, prayer, meditation, mindfulness, stress reduction. Other groups, it's important to know, use labyrinths in a lot of different ways. One of the words that a friend of mine uses, a term friend of mine uses about labyrinths, is he talks about them as open source archetypes. That's a big word, but that is to say, archetype, labyrinths are archetypes. They are a recurrent symbol that has shown up again and again throughout history and across many, many, maybe all different cultures, used to somehow express the profound and mystical nature of journeying as human experience. Okay, it's an archetype. It is this symbol that resonates with what it means to be human. And you think of our Christian context, journeying, the journey, the path is a metaphor that comes up again and again and again in scripture, in sermons, in devotion time. So it is this archetype, and labyrinths come in a lot of different shapes and sizes and forms, but it is a symbol for us. So it's also an open source archetype, though, an open source in the sense that there has been this great freedom to recontextualize and reinterpret its use through history and varying cultures. It doesn't always get used in the same way for the same purposes throughout history. And even in modern day world, there is this freedom for different people to use it for their purposes out of their needs. Does that make sense? So there really isn't one right way or small box of ways to use labyrinths or to understand their meaning. It's sort of wide open, and so it gives us this freedom to be creative with them. We know that labyrinths go back at least 6,000 years beyond the Christian tradition. So they were around even before our specific faith community arrived. And some experts believe perhaps that they've been maybe 2 to 3 times older than that, maybe 16,000 or more years old. Nobody really knows where or why they started, though, historically, and their use has always been open to interpretation. Even the folks who study labyrinths have made some big guesses as to why they were used a long time ago. Why was a labyrinth carved, a labyrinth about a meter across, carved in a stone on a mountain pass in Russia 1,200 years ago? Is it a way marker? Is it a sacred site? We don't really know. What I want to play for you now, I'm going to share my screen, and I want to play a video, and so you can just relax and watch it. It's a presentation I put together to convey the sense of where labyrinths have shown up and what they've looked like and how they've been used throughout history. So give me a second here to share my screen and just sit back for about 7 minutes and enjoy this video. And I've got to remember to share that sound, right? Okay, there we go. Okay, do you see that video now?
Yes.
Okay.
There's a screen.
Okay, do y'all have any questions about that, from that?
It's fascinating. I just thought it was wonderful. Just amazing that that's been in so many thousands and thousands of years, that it's been an important symbol.
Yeah, and it crops up throughout one culture to the next culture, sometimes influenced by a prior or overarching culture, but often in communities that are entirely separated from other communities. We just see that symbol cropping up.
Would you say that a labyrinth is always associated with the divine?
No, no. I would say it's an archetypal symbol of the human journey, and then the religious, what do I want to say? The religious meaning is a layer that's laid over it, which is not bad, but often what you find is the labyrinth is kind of a neutral symbol to a great part, and then it gives that freedom for a particular community to come and lay their meaning on top of it. And so it gets used, as you saw. They can be made out of just about anything, and they can be made relatively cheaply. You can print it off on an 8.5 by 11 sheet of paper, or you can lay terrazzo stone down in a pavilion. But they get used in secular context. We see them in public schools. We see them in counseling centers. They get used for therapeutic reasons, as well as religious and spiritual purposes. Just about a half a block I'm actually looking out my living room window right now, um, and watching cicadas bounce off the glass, but that's another story. Um,
Mhm.
but just
Yeah.
beyond the house on the other side of the street is a grade school. And on the property of that grade school, there is a labyrinth there that was put in as a tool for them to work with the children around issues of peacemaking. And one of the ways that they use it is when a child is having a particular time focusing, um, they will invite the child to go out and walk the labyrinth.
Mm.
And one of the things we know that labyrinths do is they help us focus. They help us kind of draw in and move past distraction and calm down, move past stress, and we come off of them better able to do the work that we're called to do. So they get used a lot of ways.
I was going to say, I noticed one of the examples was on a coin as
Mhm.
well, which I thought was the most interesting. I would have never thought of it being on money.
Well, and it's a Roman coin, and so you're dealing with their own Roman mythology, Theseus and the Minotaur. But it also, commerce is part of the human journey, and so it makes sense to do that. One of my friends once wrote, "Today, labyrinths are commonly used for contemplative prayer, walking, meditation, and stress reduction, but they can also be used for community building, dancing, games, or exercise by people of all ages. Labyrinths also create a multi-use space that can be used for music, theater, weddings, yoga, tai chi, and community events or festivals. Labyrinths create an attraction that brings locals and visitors into a common space with opportunity to connect for a longer period of time and more deeply." One of our disciples' churches in Colorado has a permanent labyrinth on their property, and in the summer they hold concerts on the labyrinth. Um, so they use it for the purposes of walking the path, but they also use it as a place for gathering in, and creative purposes. In this day and age, for our purposes, I want to talk about it as a spiritual tool for spiritual practice, though. And I want to talk a little bit about the difference between finger labyrinths and labyrinths you walk. Finger labyrinths are a great tool, and we'll talk about various uses for them in a bit, but they tend to be shorter exercises. It's something you do at your desk quietly, um, but they tend to be fairly brief and not take the kind of time that it takes to actually go and walk a larger labyrinth. And so you do a little bit different activities with them. But here are some ideas I want you to think about for labyrinth use, especially because you may know of churches in your area, and I'm going to show you how to find labyrinths in your area the second half of our time together. But you may have access to labyrinths, and you may be leading groups who may have access to labyrinths. I believe Gwenwood has a labyrinth, and our camp in Montana has a labyrinth. And so they're available in our places where our people gather. And if we're leading experiences, events, camps, or whatever in those places, it makes sense to kind of think creatively about how we might incorporate that tool into community life, not just our own personal life. But here are some ways that I think of as great uses for labyrinths. The first one is Sabbath keeping. Simply a place or experience of holy rest, a habitation of sanctuary. And we think of sanctuary as these spaces, physical spaces in our physical church buildings, but sanctuary is more a kind of sentiment of the heart or spirit, if you will. Finding sanctuary is more than just figuring out where that big room is in our church buildings. Um, Using labyrinths in certain ways becomes a way of making and keeping Sabbath. It's an embodiment of letting go and letting God. if you will. Another way is gratitude, practicing gratitude as an intentional practice. And gratitude, we know, is one of these spiritual practices that a lot of fairly recent research shows how it helps cultivate health, positive worldviews, happiness in a deeper sense. It can transform our grieving processes in positive ways, and it can help in recovery of trauma and stress. I think of people who practice gratitude, and I think of other people who do exactly the opposite, and you can just see the difference in their lives. Well, there are ways to use labyrinths to practice gratitude as an intentional practice. Another one is silence. In our world, modern world, in this day and age, even when we're all physically dispersed because of a pandemic, but not always, our world is filled with noise. It bombards us through our TVs and our computers and our work, and noise is everywhere. Labyrinths are a place to experience and practice silence. The kind of silence I'm talking about is described in the Greek word hesychia, which really means stillness or inner peace. It's that kind of silence. And a world that is so noisy and so loud in so many ways, to find moments of that kind of silence and experience that in our lives can be really transformative, can be really nurturing. It can be healing in some ways. Another way is hospitality. It's a place where we can practice as communities a way of intentionally making room for others, including others into our practice, a place of radical welcoming. One of the things that I used to do several years ago, because of some stuff I was working on, whenever I was in a group walk and we were all walking together, if you've ever walked a labyrinth in a group, you know that the paths are narrow enough you can't pass by. Somebody has to step out of the path and then back in. And I always just quietly, silently, without saying anything to anybody, I always made it an intention that if I was overtaking or meeting a woman on the pathway, I would step out of the way. Because ours is a culture that men too often don't step out of the path and make room for women. It's this patriarchal, misogynistic culture we live in. And so the labyrinth became a way for me to work with, how do we embody this in a world that is so much the opposite of that? And so my work, one of my works on the labyrinth, was to physically make room for another group, part of our community. What happens if you hold a labyrinth walk and invite the LGBTQ community to come in and walk as a way for you to celebrate their inclusion and full identity as part of who we are? It's a place of hospitality. Nobody is denied entrance to the labyrinth, and we don't tell anybody how they must walk. And as I talk about this stuff, also listen for the metaphor that goes on beyond just literally what I'm talking about. We don't tell others how they must walk the path. We let them walk how they are called to walk. Whenever we're working with labyrinth work, we always let our language and our insights be more than literal. We let them be metaphor. We let them be part of the symbolism that allows God to teach us. You know, I always smile when parents bring little children to the labyrinth, and little children love to run the labyrinth, and they get on and it's just natural for them, and they laugh and they celebrate. And the first thing usually, well, not usually, often, that the parents say is, "Don't run." Well, nobody told them they couldn't run. You know, I think if you've got a child on the labyrinth, as long as they're not knocking people out of the way or whatever, you know, if they're finding joy in this spiritual practice, what a tremendous gift that is. I've seen people dance. I've seen people crawl through labyrinths. And I've seen people move through labyrinths in a way that you watch and it starts making other people uncomfortable. And we have to remember that that is their walk. It's not our walk. So it's a place of hospitality. It's also a place of prayer. But the kind of prayer that I think labyrinths are best used for is a holy listening, an attentiveness to divine presence. I think if prayer is conversation, most of the time our prayer is about us telling God things. The kind of prayer that often happens on labyrinths can be that, but I think it's a better place for the other side of that conversation, for God to get a word in edgewise, if you will. Or for even God to say, I don't really have anything to say. I just want to be with you. I want to be with you in a way that you recognize I am with you. And so what better gift than to enjoy a walk along the path with our beloved? It's that kind of prayer. So what I'd like to do next is do one more little finger exercise. So find a labyrinth. You can use the same one or a different one. And we're going to take a Sabbath moment. Okay, this is another idea for how to use a finger labyrinth. So if you want to turn off your video feed again. Again, find that comfortable posture or a comfortable posture for your body. Place your hands in your lap and close your eyes. And begin to breathe slowly, deeply, restful, and just breathe for a moment. When you're ready, open your eyes. Place one of your index fingers at the entrance to the labyrinth in front of you, holding it in place for a moment. Slowly now begin to trace the pathway with your finger from the entrance to the center. Move your finger slowly, but steady. Continue to breathe slowly and deep while your finger moves through the labyrinth. And as you move through the labyrinth, pray to yourself the prayer I'm about to offer you in your own mind, in step with your breathing. Breathing in, God feeds my spirit. Breathing out, God cleans my soul. Breathing in, God feeds my spirit. Breathing out, God cleans my soul. In your mind, over and over as you breathe in sync with your breath, just remind yourself, say that prayer to yourself in your mind over and over again as you move through the labyrinth. Once in the center, then place your hands in your lap. Continue to breathe the prayer. Breathing in, God feeds my spirit. Breathing out, God cleans my soul. And in the center, take a short moment to give gratitude for this moment of Sabbath rest. When you're ready, go ahead and place your index finger back to the labyrinth center and begin to trace the same path back out to the entrance. Again, paying attention to your breath, mindful, deep, slow, restful. Don't rush to get back to the entrance. Mindfully notice the labyrinth's pathway in the place where your finger happens to be in the moment. Savor the roundedness of each turn pulling you forward. Enjoy the journey rather than anticipating the destination. Breathing in, God feeds our spirits. Breathing out, God cleans our soul. And once you arrive back at the entrance and your finger has exited the labyrinth, go ahead and turn your video back on and wait until everyone else is finished. If you would like, while you're waiting, once you're done, go ahead and use the back of your labyrinth page to write down additional thoughts or feelings, ideas or senses, maybe questions that arose for you during this time on the labyrinth. Okay. Any questions or anything that anybody would like to share about their experience? Rosemary.
I had kind of a bad experience this time. I chose a bigger labyrinth and I got lost. I got quite frustrated and fearful. And now I'm thinking back that that's kind of what happens in my life. I think when I try to find places of peace and understanding. So it's sort of saying something to me here about expectations. I thought, oh no, I don't know how to do this, or I'm trying to do this right and on time. And anyway, I have to confess that it was a disturbing.
And that's perfect, Rosemary, because in life, when that happens to us, we say, oh, geez, I messed up. I'm such an idiot.
Yes.
Or why do I always do that?
Right.
On the labyrinth, the question to ask is, oh, that's interesting. How is that like my life? How is that like my faith, my Christian faith? How is that like my practice? You know,
Yeah.
we all, have you ever been lost spiritually? Have you ever like made a wrong turn somewhere and, you know, on the labyrinth, what was the worst thing that happened? Maybe you didn't make it to the center, but being lost is also a part of the human condition sometimes. And if we can learn that that's okay, God is still with us. We may not know where on the path we are exactly, but we're still on the path. Those are the kind of lessons that the labyrinth can teach us. I have an interesting insight for you. If you're walking a labyrinth and you're in the middle of a labyrinth walk and you don't pay attention and you happen to step over one line on any labyrinth walk, do you know what happens? You're automatically going in the opposite direction. So if you were headed toward the center and you step over somewhere, anywhere on the labyrinth, one line, you're now headed back toward the entrance.
Interesting.
I've had people say, you know, I've had people go, you know, I realize that I do that a lot. I don't pay attention sometimes and I end up not where I needed to be. I had one lady who was coming out of a labyrinth, and when you lead labyrinth walks, the facilitator kind of stands there and holds space, praying for people, kind of watching to make sure everything's okay. We don't ever step on to rescue somebody. Rescuing is not helpful on the labyrinth. But I happened to watch this lady come out of the middle, and I noticed she kind of got confused, and I watched her, and she stepped over a line about halfway back toward the entrance. And in a little bit, she was back in the center. We were debriefing afterward, and I said, "So how was your walk?" She said, "Well, a really interesting thing happened." She said, "I was headed out, and I don't know what I did, but I think God figured that I hadn't spent enough time praying in the center. And so God sent me back to the center, and I don't know how it happened." So for her, it was this wonderful surprise of a mistake wasn't made. She was simply being redirected, so she found the positive and the blessing in the experience. So it's up to us to interpret that, Rosemary. I would suggest practically that with finger labyrinths, you find one with a wider pathway, maybe, or a simpler design. If you have trouble following, the big 11 circuit Chartres that I gave you is pretty complex. I love this design, but to get it to fit on an 8.5 by 11 sheet of paper, the pathway is really small. And so, that might not be the best one for you to use, and that's okay. I've heard when people walk labyrinths, they'll say, "Well, I get dizzy." And when you're beginning labyrinth work, that could happen because you're always focused downward. As you gain more experience with labyrinths, you tend to be looking up and watching the pathway peripherally. Sometimes people also move too fast, and so that can make them dizzy. But comfort with labyrinths, like any spiritual practice, comes with repetitive practice, and you get better with it. Jennifer, we're going to talk about the seed pattern. Don't worry about it in the second half. So I got that handled, and I wanted you to look at it and not know what it was, but it's going to be a fun little thing we do with that. So hang on.
Warren,
Yes, Marvin.
first of all, Teresa's trying to get in. She's tried to say something 2 or 3 times. Do you want to?
Yeah, go for it.
Do you want to go in, and then I'd like to follow her?
Okay.
That's fine. Your comment on feeling dizzy when you're looking down really prompted me to also think, when we're looking down and not looking outward, that can impact us physically, spiritually. Perhaps that was intended to come to be kind of a subtle extra about that comment, but I thought that was really interesting. I am curious if I could backtrack just a minute. I noticed
Yep.
some of the labyrinths. I never can say this word, labyrinths. In your presentation, have symbols in the middle or designs in the center.
Mhm.
Is that more prevalent in consumer versus spiritual? Mhm.
You're talking about that one?
Well, actually, there was some that had, it looked like people in the middle or something.
Oh, in the actual presentation in the video. Um, they can mean a lot of different things. In those historical labyrinths, you may have seen what looked like a man in the middle.
Right.
That actually is the Minotaur.
Ah,
And that comes out of that Roman mythology of, if you know the mythology, there was this big labyrinth, and the way that the king tortured enemies and executed enemies was to put them into the labyrinth, which really was a maze, probably not a labyrinth. And I'll talk about that in a minute. But put them into the labyrinth, and then the Minotaur, which was this great beast, this monster, killed and consumed
right.
these enemies, and it was also a way of appeasing the monster. Okay, So I'm telling a story as if it were literal, but you've got to listen to it symbolically. Like a lot of scripture, it's important to listen to it not simply as a literal story, but as the symbolism behind it. So Theseus, this great hero, went into the labyrinth. Nobody else had ever made it out of the labyrinth. So Theseus' lover, Ariadne, gave Theseus this magic thread, and he tied it to himself, and he walked in, and the thread slowly let out as he walked in. He went in, killed the Minotaur, and then followed the magic thread back out. And that's how he made it out. So often in these old labyrinths, historical, especially Roman or European labyrinths, you'll often see the Minotaur depicted in the middle, and you might even see a thread running through it in some places. So an interesting thing happens when the Christian community begins to use labyrinths. Very often they adopted Roman patterns, okay? Of course, Christians never adopt other people's stuff, right? Christmas trees come from pagan, rituals, and our cross is an executioner's device. We adopt symbols and we reimagine new meaning, okay? Well, early on, Christians were adopting Roman patterns, and that's why you often would see early on either a round or a square shape of this classical design, which is one of the oldest designs we know of. We've found in archaeological projects within Christian worshiping sites, tile labyrinths that have the Minotaur in the center and a thread winding through. Well, why would a Christian community have Roman mythology? Well, what we think happened was that the Minotaur became not just a Roman mythological beast, but a metaphor for all that seeks to consume us in the world. Christians can relate to that. As people who were being oppressed and tortured and ostracized, there's a lot of stuff. There are a lot of monsters that seek to undo us, but there are also a lot of monsters inside that seek to undo us. Depression, whatever, can be a lot of grief, can be a lot of things. So that Minotaur is there as a symbol for the Christian community, that there are things on our journey that will undo us if we're not careful. Well, and then there's this thread that's still in there. What do you think the thread becomes in early Christian labyrinth use? What is the thing that guides us along the pathway? The thread becomes a symbol for Holy Spirit. And so you've got these very old labyrinth designs that have early Roman mythological symbols who early on, even within Catholic churches, were still being used and reinterpreted. And slowly over time, most labyrinths began to lose those particular symbols. But I think for me, it's a very fun way of saying that mythology has a way of also being open source. If you understand it symbolically, it's not just about necessarily one culture's ideas. It's about learning and understanding and being taught by these universal values in our life. So that's why you would see those characters. In some of the early indigenous labyrinths of the Americas, like the Tohono O'odham people in Southwest Arizona, their man in the maze labyrinths, there is a little man at the entrance, and it literally is the man figure. It is us. It's the person looking into the journey ahead. And so now on the modern day reservation, we used to visit the mission church there when we'd go down to visit Betsy, my wife's folks, in the springtime when they used to live down in southern Arizona. And at the mission church, there's the schools right there, and there's a artist community there, and there's the police office there, and then the mission, and that symbol's all over the mission. That labyrinth, man in the maze, indigenous labyrinth, is at the gate to the mission. You literally are reminded of your journey as you enter the mission. It's also on the front door of the school. Children are reminded they are entering into this pathway of education. And so it gets used in that way. And in that case, the symbol literally is a symbol for the person looking at it. That's me as I'm about to enter whatever I'm entering. And a call to be faithful to the path, if you will. So
Thank you for letting me back things up a little bit there.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Marvin, did you have something?
Well, this is not a surprise to people who know me, but when we were going through the last exercise on the way out, you told us to take as much time as we wanted. And then you were pushing me to get through, and I wanted to say to you, shut up. That's kind of my reaction to authority who's trying to tell me to do something, because I was on a different pace than you were. And all of a sudden I was not doing what I was told to do. And so there was an interesting authority response, submission, whole sort of thing that taught me, because that was my reaction to that.
And I think that's really important with labyrinth work. One of the things I'm going to talk about early toward the beginning of our second session together is the idea that any instructions about labyrinths you get are to be taken as suggestion. And in this kind of space, virtual space, it's hard to see where I can't see where you all are. If we were in person, I'd see where you were on the journey with your finger, and I'd probably slow down. The other thing to say is, you don't have to follow me. Nobody said you had to follow me, and that is a hard lesson for us to learn,
Yeah.
especially in, I'm going to use Orthodox with a little o, within an Orthodox Christian community. We are even disciples by our nature are rule followers. There are things that are expected of us, and we expect ourselves to be expected of that. With labyrinths, if somebody hands you a sheet of paper at the entrance of the labyrinth, and it is your sense that is not what you're called to do, put that dang piece of paper down. You do what you want. You do what you need to do. And that's the wonderfulness about Labyrinth as a practice too, because it is this open source archetype. Anything that somebody else lays on top of it is what they laid on top of it. And it might be a really cool creative thing to do, and you might want to do it, but you may get to the labyrinth and Spirit says to you, Warren, that's not what you need to be doing right now. Marvin, that's not what you need to be doing right now. And we need to listen to Spirit more than we need to listen to other humans. But I've also had the experience where I've watched people not do something, and it became really pretty obvious in their behavior that it was ego was talking rather than Spirit. And so that's, we have to navigate that space too. Who am I really listening to? But I resonate with you, Marvin. I get in some places where one person, Lori Riddell can tell me to do something, and I will do it every time if Lori Riddell tells me to do something. But there are certain people in the general church that if they tell me to do it, I'm sorry, not going to do it. Even if it's the same thing Lori told me to do, it's how we are made.
Yeah.
So does anybody have anything else?
Yes,
Sandy.
Warren, I have kind of a couple historic type questions. So in the pictures that you showed us in the video,
Mhm.
you know, some were on coins and some were much bigger. Was there a progression um, from it being an archetype, a symbol, to walking it, or was it always, as far as we can tell, something people walked as well as something people saw that reminded them?
I think often it was, I think it's both. It's hard to know historically. There are some, especially in Russia, there are some very ancient labyrinths that are walkable pathways in Russia. Old. Um, and we think that labyrinths, and there are some very old ones in India too. And we think that that pattern, if there was any influence, came out of India and Russia into other places. We think the Roman Empire was early adopters of things that they saw elsewhere, and it made sense to them. They understood the language, they understood the archetype. A lot of the terrazzo stone or tile labyrinths that we found archaeologically are domestic labyrinths. They really more fit the purpose of a rug in a domestic space in a house. They aren't necessarily big enough to walk the pathways, or maybe that
Yeah.
that far apart. But they become something that you can look at and draw meaning from looking at it. But they're more an architectural feature, a domestic architectural feature, like we'd have a pretty rug. They tend to be architectural features that are full of symbolism, because that was who they were culturally. You don't separate those two. So
Yeah.
it's hard to know. I think really the earliest Christian labyrinth in northern Africa was found archaeologically essentially within, it was what we would think of as a house church, but it was what was in what would roughly be compared to their sanctuary, their meeting space. Well, that's pretty. But it wasn't big enough to walk,
Mhm.
but it was in the center of their space. It was a prominent visual symbol of meaning for them.
Great. And is there a relationship between labyrinths and mazes?
Okay, yeah, I was going to say something. In Europe, you will often hear folks refer to labyrinths as mazes. It's a language issue thing, but by and large, when we talk about mazes, we're talking about, I'm going to use a big word here and explain it. We're talking about multi-cursal pathways with more than one way to go, multi directions. And the easiest way to talk about that is the mazes scientists designed for rats to test intelligence and learning. And they intentionally design a maze to confuse the rat. Okay. Mazes are designed to confuse. Do you go left? Do you go right here? And then next, do you go left or do you right? Labyrinths are not multicursal, they're unicursal. There is one pathway. There's never any intersections where you have to decide, do you go right or left? Labyrinths are unicursal, and they're designed to bring clarity. That's kind of a modern way of us understanding that. When you enter a labyrinth, at no place do you have to say, do I go right or do I go left? And so that part of your brain, that analytical part of your brain that's always problem solving, because it's this narrow pathway and it's winding and you just have to follow it. That analytical part of our brain quiets down. There's been some brain studies, and that part of our brain literally quiets down. The parts of our brain that begin to have more activity is that creative side, where dreams, where prayer, where contemplation happens. That opens up. Our world tends to always keep our analytical part of our mind busy. And that other side of our mind doesn't have a lot of space, if you will, a lot of time, because it's it's the other part's working overtime. Mazes allow that balance where we can begin to work with creativity, we can begin to work spiritually, if you will, that side of our mind. So
Thank you.
we're just at about an hour and a half. This is what I wanted this last half hour to be, was some dialogue. I want to talk about some uses for finger labyrinths. Therapists will often use them with patients, depending on what they're dealing with before the session, to kind of help focus, or after a session to kind of help that person wind down or move out of. I have a friend here that's a member of the church I go to, who's a therapist, and she has a walking labyrinth outside her office, and she will invite patients sometimes either before or after session to go and walk the labyrinth, and maybe she'll give them a question to ask or something to think about while they're doing it. But it's a part of therapy. Finger labyrinths can be that. We are seeing them more and more, well, pre-pandemic, we were seeing them more and more being laminated. So they were paper, just laminated. So they were easy to clean and sterilize, and being put in waiting rooms of hospitals as something for people to do while they're waiting nervously or anticipation of a loved one in surgery or being treated or whatever. I have a lot of clergy friends who use finger labyrinths as transition practices between events. If they've had a particularly stressful meeting or session, we'll use it after that as a way to kind of center, refocus, calm down, de-stress. If they're getting ready, preparing for an event or a meeting or something, they will use it as a way to focus in and settle and be prepare themselves to move mindfully into that next event. Or sometimes just as a way to not simply rush out from one thing to another. They use it as a way to go, wait, time out. I want to rest. I want to breathe before I move on to that next mission of care that I'm called to do. So that's a really good way for us to use labyrinths. I've told people that when I was doing in past life in pastoral ministry, you'd go into a hospital setting and there's a family member who's just particularly upset and stressful, and sometimes what I would hear is they're upset mostly because they don't know what to pray. They don't know how to pray. They want to pray, but they don't know what to pray or how. And so I invite them into a breath prayer, that breathing in, God feeds my spirit, breathing out, and remind them that even when we don't know the words to use, a breath breathed mindfully with gratitude is a prayer in and of itself. And sometimes that's the best prayer you can. Just breathe and be reminded that that breath is a gift from God, and let your breath be a prayer of gratitude. That, coupled with labyrinth work, is a really great exercise. So, is there anything else? Ed, who's with you? Because I don't know a lot of you.
Hi, I'm Laura.
Hi, Laura.
Hi, I have a question. Is there a place for a spiral in labyrinths, or is it too simple? In other words, it doesn't require enough of your attention?
If you saw that video, you saw that Ecclesiasticus prayer labyrinth. That was a spiral. Most labyrinth makers I know think a spiral is too simple in and of itself, but it is a labyrinth. It fits the definition of being unicursal, one pathway. It winds and turns. To me, it gets predictable, but it can be used. Where I see spirals sometimes is that let me pull this up, with a with this kind of a, you have all this twist and turn going on. And then as you get toward the center, I've seen some labyrinths where there's 2 or 3, maybe 4 circuits where in the very center at the end, it spirals into the center. And so, yeah, they can be parts of labyrinths and they can be whole labyrinths. It really depends on what kind of design you're drawn to.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Warren, it's interesting that at Valley Medical Center in Renton, which is a public hospital,
Mhm.
they have installed a labyrinth in an outside garden area close to the intensive care unit.
Mhm. Yeah, lots of hospitals are putting them in. For those of you in Seattle, one of your most famous labyrinths, do you know guess where it might be?
At the University of Washington?
Nope.
No.
It's at the Seattle Center,
Hmm.
right outside the Jimi Hendrix Museum, and right below the Space Needle, there's a giant orange labyrinth that is the Chartres Cathedral design.
Hmm.
Right next to the fairly new, I mean, several years old now, but fairly new children's play area there that has all sorts of musical stuff incorporated into the play equipment. It's fabulous. One of the, not the last time I walked it, but 2 times ago and several years now, I remember I'd gotten there early in the morning and started walking, and they were just getting ready to open up the Jimi Hendrix Museum. And all of a sudden, out of the loudspeakers there at the music stand, Jimi Hendrix music started blasting. And so I'm walking this labyrinth to Jimi Hendrix, and it was kind of surreal, but again, you work with the metaphor. And so, we all like to have these quiet spiritual experiences, but listen to the metaphor. How do we walk the path amidst the loud, distracting noise of the world? And so you begin this kind of juxtaposition of one experience over the other, and playing with how we do our spiritual work in a world that really conspires to defeat that work. The other thing was that I kind of happened to like Jimi Hendrix music, and so it really wasn't that bad. And it also became sort of this fun, celebrative walk too. So there is that. So Sandy, we are done now for a half hour. Is that right?
That's right. We'll come
Okay.
back at 11 o'clock Pacific time.
Okay.
Nice to see you, Virginia.
Hello.
Joined us.
I guess I screwed up. I didn't get the right time till now.
It's all right. It's been at 10 every Saturday. This is the first time it's been at 9.
I know. My head isn't working quite right. I had this altercation. I had this altercation with the floor.
Virginia,
Yes.
I saw your name on the list, and I was so happy to see your name on the list.
Well, that was one reason I wanted to be in on this, because I remember you as a much younger person.
Yeah, I know. And I'm sorry for that impression at that time.
No. I'm that getting older and older is much better than the alternative.
I hear you, but I have to say you were one of my heroes of the faith. So I'm so happy to see you.
Well, I'm so surprised that I'm a hero of anything.
Oh,
You are. So
Well, I don't talk well because I have a broken jaw.
yeah,
well, Sandy told me, and I'm so sorry to hear that.
Well, it's all right. I learned something new. Hospitals have jaw bras. And you raise the jaw, they put the stuff on, and then they put a thing on, and they call it a jaw bra.
Okay. I know people I'd like to put one on sometimes, but probably for a different purpose. So Marvin wanted to get something in here.
Just a question, do we conclude at noon our time?
We would conclude at 12:30. We have another hour and
Okay,
a half, or
okay.
until we're, if we finish earlier.
And it may not take
Yeah.
that much time too. So
Okay, so
Do you have
we're-
any instructions for us, Warren, during this break?
No,
Or-
we were originally the description, we thought you were going to have longer time, and I was going to invite you, if you knew of a labyrinth, to go walk one. But we're going to do something a little bit different. And no, just come back with your handouts. And you'll also want that, you'll especially want that seed pattern that Jennifer was wondering what the heck that was. And we're going to play around with that. We're going to talk about some spiritual practice tools in general that apply really well to labyrinth work, but some ideas for maximizing any spiritual practice that you're working with. And then we'll look at kind of a generic, how do you walk a labyrinth that you can then take and modify and change up to do all sorts of things. So and then we'll have a couple exercises, I think, too. I'm going to show you the North American labyrinth map that I've got online that lets you find labyrinths wherever you happen to be, permanent walkable labyrinths that are open to the public wherever you happen to be in North America. So we'll play around with that so you get a sense of how to use that. If you want to go, I wonder if there's a labyrinth near me, beyond the ones that I already know about at the hospital or whatever. So we're going to do some of that, and we'll just see where it goes.
Okay, so 11
That's
o'clock.
In a half an hour.
Yeah.
Thanks for including the Edmonds labyrinth in your presentation too.
Yeah, I honestly don't know if that one's still there. I have a hunch it probably is, but I love that labyrinth.
Yeah.
Yep. Okay, I'll see you all. I'm going to go get a cup of coffee, and I'll see you all in a half an hour.